This week we take a step backwards to look at the evolution of media, new media and social media. Now for those of us who grew up in the 70s and 80s, and before of course, there's a sense of real social upheaval, and technological changes we've seen in our lifetime truly are revolutionary. Some may even view it as chaotic. The way we communicate has changed, and the way we're marketed to has changed. But these media revolutions really aren't so new. History reveals a long list of social disruptions. This week you'll hear Elizabeth Eisenstein talk about printing as an emancipatory force. As she says, printing was associated with rebellion and emancipation. Yet printing is something we take for granted today. Likewise, social media is also becoming something we take for granted as an integral part of life. Now, this was not the case at all when I started teaching this course back in 2011. A lot has changed just in that short period of time. So this week, think about this. If printing is associated with rebellion and emancipation, what is social media associated with? Now, some other questions for this week. What profound effects will this latest version of participatory culture have on communication and media? Are technology-caused media revolutions anything new? Where do we get our news from? How do we validate sources? What are the characteristics of our social networks? What does social media literacy mean? What's it mean for us? So what is new media? Up through the 20th century, traditional media was characterized by big media. These are the big newspaper companies, the big TV channels, media producers. Media was controlled and created by a handful of big media players and broadcasted out to the masses. Now this has given way to new media. It's a broad term, but generally refers to this more democratic creation, publishing, and distribution of media, all through the use of digital tools, your iPad, your smartphone, laptop, etc. It's also the rise of personal journalism. Now through blogs, Twitter, and other internet tools, any individual can contribute to the creation and spread of news. But personal journalism is nothing new. There have been individuals speaking out publicly for centuries. Benjamin Franklin, with his often controversial Pennsylvania Gazette, he took over the paper in 1729 and used it as a tool for moral instruction in the new colonies. Incidentally, he was the creator of the first political cartoons created in the U.S. The pamphleteers in the late 18th century published their views long before the First Amendment protected their freedom of speech. The most famous was Thomas Paine, who advocated colonial independence and did a lot to inspire the American patriots in 1776 to declare independence from Britain. His pamphlets were widely circulated and read aloud in taverns. This was their version of something going viral. The Federalist Papers were written and circulated to promote ratification of the Constitution in 1787 and 88. And then in the early 19th century, there was the rise of the independent journalist known as the muckraker, who questioned the dark side of society, such as unfair labor practices or anti-competitive activities. Two examples here are Upton Sinclair, who published The Jungle in 1906, where he revealed the horrific conditions in the meatpacking industry. Another is Lincoln Steffens, who took on corrupt politicians in St. Louis with the publishing in 1902 of The Tweed Days in St. Louis. The works of the muckrakers had a lasting impact on society by leading to the first child labor laws, the creation of the Pure Food and Drug Administration, and other major legislative achievements. History is marked by technological advances causing media revolutions and political change. So again, this really is nothing new. And to name a few, the printing press, the rise of the railroads, and the telegraph. So think of social media in this light. Now, here's a very compact view of the evolution of media technologies and communication tools. Now, this is not to scale. This slide is meant to give you a quick overview of the evolution, and we could go farther back than the 1400s, but for our purposes, we're going to start with the 1400s and focus primarily on major events in the U.S. as they happened. So each of these events, up until the 1900s, was a media revolution in and of itself. After, probably mid-1900s, the changes and technological advances were happening so rapidly. So in and of themselves, each wasn't a revolution, but part of a bigger one. Okay, the first newspapers appear in 1450, followed by the Gutenberg Press. The 1840s saw the development of the electric telegraph, which allowed communications to be separated from transportation for the first time. 1860, the Pony Express was a mail delivery system that allowed the first east-west mode of communication and helped tie California in with the Union before the telegraph took over. 1876, Alexander Graham Bell patented the electric telephone. 1887, Emil Berliner invents the gramophone, which allowed something to be recorded and played over and over again. 1920s and 1930s, the first radio and TV broadcasts occurred in the U.S. Then we jump to the 20th century. In 1965, the first form of electronic mail, although arguably some earlier versions of email did exist, such as Morse code. This was the first email sent as a precursor to today's email, as we know it. This happened at MIT. 1969, ARPANET, the precursor to the Internet, funded by the U.S. Department of Defense. It was the first operational packet switching network. In 1969, we also saw the birth of CompuServe. This started as an in-house dial-up computer processing support, but in the late 80s and early 90s was really the first online service to offer Internet connectivity. 1978, the first bulletin board systems, which allowed users to run a software program and connect to the system using a terminal program. They then could exchange info through email or message boards. 1985, and I want to point this out because this is pretty important here. 1985 was the founding of one of the very first virtual communities called The Well. It started as a dial-up bulletin board and then became one of the original dial-up ISPs in the 1990s when commercial traffic was allowed on the internet. It actually still in its existence today, making it one of the oldest virtual communities in continuous operation. And the study of The Well as a community in and of itself is a fascinating study, and there's been some articles written and research which I'll post for the class to view if you're interested in the history of this. 1986, first electronic mailing list software application was launched. 1989, the birth of America Online. Although AOL had existed under other names before that, it was primarily a dial-up service for gamers where you bought a modem and a subscription. In the late 80s, though, it was the first step in bringing online services to the mass market. Those who weren't computer geeks and techies, and it eventually dominated CompuServe. 1988, Internet Relay Chat, backbone of real-time internet text messaging, allowed for group conferencing and one-to-one messaging. And then 1994, the government releases control of the internet, and the World Wide Web is born. In this last era, we see the start of many of the tools that are a foundation of today's social media tools. 1999, Power Labs launches one of the earliest blog publishing tools. It was later purchased by Google. 1999 also was Napster, one of the first and most successful P2P file sharing services. 2001, Wikipedia, the largest and most successful general reference work on the internet. And then 2001, StumbleUpon also. 2002, Friendster, one of the first social networking sites. Really started this idea of friending someone long before Facebook and MySpace took over. They had 3 million subscribers in the first 3 months. Since then, I believe it's actually now defunct. Okay, 2003, the first social bookmarking sites. Then we have MySpace, LinkedIn, StumbleUpon, Second Life, kicked off the popularity of online virtual worlds. 2004, Flickr, the start of photo sharing, YouTube, Twitter, and it goes on from there. So that was a very quick crash course, summing up centuries of progress in just a few moments. And we'll cover all these topics more in depth with the readings and discussions this week. So what is participatory culture? This is pretty important in understanding and as we discuss the evolution of social media. It's a common theme throughout this course. Henry Jenkins and his team in their book Confronting the Challenges of Participatory Culture said it's when a social environment is created where citizens can actively create content and take part in cultural production. Here are some defining characteristics. If you apply these to any of the social networks you belong to, you'll most likely be able to check off each of these characteristics. There are relatively low barriers to artistic expression and civic engagement, so anyone can join. Strong support for creating and sharing one's creations with others. There's some type of informal membership whereby what is known by the most experienced is passed along to novices. Members believe that their contributions matter, and members feel some degree of social connection with one another. Tim O'Reilly introduced the notion of architecture of participation, which you'll also hear a lot about in the course. This is the nature of systems that are designed to allow for user contribution. It's the architecture that allows for endless small contributions to add up to public good. The foundation of the web itself, built by Tim Berners-Lee, falls under this characterization. It was built for the public domain. Another great example is Linus Torvalds Linux, which is a computer operating system that is defined by open source software. All of the underlying source code may be used, modified, and distributed commercially or non-commercially. Then there's the rise of the prosumer and the peer-to-peer economy. Prosumer was coined by futurist Alvin Toffler. Traditionally, it was the producer who created content and cultural objects, and the consumer was the one who consumed the content by reading or watching. But now these lines have blurred, and the consumer has access to the tools and the content to do the creation and distribution herself. So this is from Professor Judy Franks of Northwestern University, and let's look at, if we look at the old school realities and then what the new realities today of the media ecosystem, we see an interesting shift. So if you think old school, what traditional media was first certainty. Each medium had a specific function and utility. A newspaper was something printed on paper that you read. TV was something in a box that you sat down to watch. So each has a specific function and utility. Number two is selection. Audiences were highly selected, so usually you chose one media over another at the expense of another. So you chose one or the other. Now three, I think this is the most interesting and the most illuminating, is that media was linear. So content moved from point A to B with limited disruption. So whereas news may have been broadcast on several different media, the content itself that was published in a newspaper stayed in a newspaper. Content on TV stayed on TV. 4, production. So the media in itself was the product. The newspaper was the product. The TV was a product. You bought your TV channels, you bought your newspaper channel, your newspaper subscription, your magazine subscription. And lastly, the audience aggregated around the media and not the content. So what's happening now, the new realities, new school, is one, it's all about convergence. Everything's on a screen. Everything's come together on a screen, whether it's your smartphone or your laptop. 2 is symbiosis. Audiences use media in combination, so everything's come together also. So you're not choosing one media over the other. You're actually using them all together, even at the same time. Now 3, again, this goes back to originally it was very linear. Content moved from A to B with no disruption. Now we're seeing that content moves freely among the media platforms, or the circuits. The audience no longer is just a recipient, but accelerator of content. So you may view content on your mobile phone. You're going to forward it to somebody who's going to view it on another device, who's going to forward it then to somebody else. So the content is moving freely among the different platforms, no longer A to B, but is being passed on and accelerated by the consumer of the content. Okay, before, whereas the media was seen as the product in and of itself, a newspaper or a TV channel, now the media has to be a brand. It's no longer just about the technology and the distribution strength of a media, but it's about the brand. It's the ESPN brand, it's the HBO brand, it's the CNN brand. It doesn't matter how you view that content anymore. It's not tied to a media platform, but it's about how much trust you have in that media source. And lastly, that takes us to the economics. So now it's all about the content. It's not so much about the platform and the distribution. As long as you have engaging content, you will have an audience that either pays for it or engages with it and passes it on. Real quick, here's a chart showing how trust in media source has changed. And I think most interesting here, if you look versus how we access our information, search engines, traditional media, online-only media, owned media, social media. You can see between 2012 and 2016 how it's changed. And the biggest change is going to be we're using search engines more to access media, and we're relying a little bit less on traditional media. Another big message here is looking at millennials, how they're even more trusting of digital media than the general population. So the next generations are going to be even more trusting of these new ways of consuming and accessing news. It's important to make some comments here on social media literacy. Literacy as it pertains to the written word has always been an important measure of the development of a country. Now when it comes to social media, like books, there's a certain level of literacy needed. So what does social media literacy mean? Here's a quote from Caitlin Tillman. Social media literacy is having the proficiency to communicate appropriately, responsibly, and to evaluate conversations critically with the realm of socially based technologies. So social media literacy is not only about having the skill to read, but it's also being able to use the medium effectively. And what's that mean for us? It means that there's a level of proficiency needed. We need to be able to filter out information. We've got to be able to weed out the bad from the good. We need to know about sources and be able to validate and check sources. Not everything you read on the internet is true, and how do we know what's true and what's not? And this I think is really evident when it comes during political seasons or campaigning seasons, when there's a lot of information out there which is not always validated or checked. Also, we need to be aware of filter bubbles. Search engines and browsers are collecting so much information on us that we're now being served information based on our profiles. So what one person may see on the internet may differ strongly from what others see. And we'll cover this in the final unit. So what the collection of data means for privacy and marketing capabilities is pretty critical. Then lastly, the importance of knowing how to communicate appropriately and responsibly using social media platforms. So, and I'll leave you with the final quote for the week. This is from Howard Rheingold. Social media literacies are a critical uncertainty in the issue of whether digital media improve or erode human individual capacities and collective culture. Just as in the eras following the invention of the alphabet and printing press, literate populations become the driving force that shape new media. What we know now matters in shaping the ways people will use and misuse social media for decades to come.